The morning of May 27, 1944, arrived over northeastern France the way death often does, quietly, without warning, wrapped in deceptive beauty. At 28,000 feet, the sky above the German border was the deep crystalline blue that artists spend their whole lives trying to capture and never quite do. There were no clouds at altitude. The visibility was perfect, which meant that everything up here could see everything else. Inside the narrow, oil-smelling cockpit of his P-51B Mustang, Captain Clarence Emil Anderson was cold in a way that civilian life never prepares a man for. The temperature beyond his plexiglass canopy hovered at 60 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds, cold enough to turn hydraulic fluid to molasses, cold enough to make the aluminum skin of his aircraft contract and groan like a living thing. He felt it through his flat boots, through his gloves, through the metal of the control stick pressed against his palm. He had learned after months of combat to stop noticing it. The cold was simply the price of admission up here. His aircraft was a machine he knew the way a rancher knows his best horse, not by its specifications, but by its personality. Serial number 4324823, nicknamed Old Crow after the cheapest bourbon available at the bars near Newcastle, California, where Anderson had grown up, the son of a farmer. The name was a joke, a small act of irreverence painted on 9,000 pounds of the most lethal single-engine fighter the Allied forces had ever put in the sky. Anderson was 22 years old. Within the 357th Fighter Group, a unit so aggressive that its unofficial motto might as well have been "First in, last out," Bud Anderson occupied a unique position. He was not the loudest voice in the briefing room. He did not swagger. He did not collect admirers the way some of the flashier aces did, signing autographs and talking to war correspondents. What Anderson had was something that couldn't be taught in a ground school and couldn't be faked in a training exercise. He had the ability to process the three-dimensional chaos of aerial combat the way a chess grandmaster processes a board, seeing not just the current position, but every possible position 3 moves ahead. His squadron mates called it having eyes in the back of your head. His crew chief called it spooky. Chuck Yeager, who flew with him and against him in training and respected very few men unconditionally, would later call it something simpler: genius. This morning, Anderson was leading cement flight. 4 Mustangs flying close escort on a massive stream of B-17 flying fortresses grinding eastward toward the strategic rail yards at Strasbourg. The bombers flew at 160 miles per hour, their contrails painting thick white lines across the sky like chalk marks on a blackboard, broadcasting their position to every German radar operator and fighter controller from Paris to Berlin. They were enormous, magnificent, and terrifyingly vulnerable. 10 men in a metal tube with no ability to maneuver, dependent entirely on the fighters weaving protectively around them. The first 2 hours were silent. Blue sky, engine noise, the steady droning of formation flight, the kind of quiet that experienced combat pilots learned to distrust completely.
Then, at just past 11 in the morning, the radio exploded. "Bandits! 12 o'clock high! Jesus, how many are there?" Anderson's eyes snapped upward through the curved glass of his canopy. What he saw in the next 2 seconds rewired something fundamental in his understanding of the word outnumbered. It wasn't a fighter squadron. It wasn't a wing. It was a river, a dark, churning river of aircraft flowing across the upper sky, more than 60 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s organized into the massive attack formation the Luftwaffe called a Gefechtsverband, a battle formation designed for one purpose: to overwhelm American escort fighters through sheer, crushing mass and punch through to the bombers behind them. They moved with the terrible momentum of something inevitable, their yellow-painted engine cowlings catching the morning sun like the eyes of predators. The arithmetic was immediate and brutal. In Anderson's sector, the ratio was approximately 15 German fighters for every American one. Before we go further into what happened next, if you value real history told without shortcuts, please hit the like button below. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel reach the people who need to hear these stories. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and whether anyone in your family wore a uniform in the Second World War. We read every single one. Now, back to 28,000 feet, where Bud Anderson is doing the math and arriving at the only answer his character allows. The doctrine of self-preservation said protect your aircraft, maintain formation integrity, do not engage at unfavorable odds. The 357th Fighter Group's doctrine said something different. It said the bombers do not get touched. Whatever it costs, whatever the odds, the bombers do not get touched. Anderson's thumb found the radio transmit button. His voice, when it came, carried none of the adrenaline that was currently flooding every cell in his body. Cement flight, drop tanks, war emergency power, on me. Beneath the silver belly of Old Crow, 2 75-gallon external fuel tanks fell away into the void, tumbling end over end toward the French countryside far below. The aircraft immediately felt lighter, more alive, like a sprinter shrugging off a backpack. Anderson pushed the throttle past its mechanical stop into the war emergency power range that the engineers officially discouraged and combat pilots used constantly. The Packard Merlin engine, a masterpiece of British engineering built under American license, responded with a howl that Anderson felt in his teeth. He pushed the nose over and dove. The speed built with shocking violence, 350 miles an hour, 400, 420, touching 460 as the Mustang fell toward the German formation with all the patience and restraint of a thrown stone. The airframe shivered and went rigid as aerodynamic forces compressed against every surface. The sound outside the canopy shifted from a roar to a high, tearing shriek.
Below him, the chaos was already in full motion. Focke-Wulf 190s, the thick-bodied, radial-engined butcher birds that Luftwaffe pilots loved for their firepower and toughness, were setting up head-on passes against the lead bomber boxes. Bf 109s were working the flanks, their 20mm engine cannons winking orange as they raked across B-17 wings. 3 bombers were already trailing smoke. One was falling out of formation entirely, its number 3 engine a ball of orange fire, tiny figures spilling from its waist windows into the freezing slipstream. Anderson picked his first target with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this before. 3 Bf 109s in a loose trail formation, lining up behind a straggling B-17 that had drifted 50 yards outside the protection of its combat box. The German pilots were entirely focused on the kill in front of them. They had not looked up. They had not looked behind them. They had not looked for the silver shape dropping on them at nearly 500 miles per hour from the direction of the sun. Anderson adjusted his angle by 2 degrees. He waited until the lead Messerschmitt filled his N9 gun sight from wingtip to wingtip. He wanted 250 yards, closer than doctrine recommended, close enough that the probability of missing approached 0. He squeezed the trigger, and Old Crow shook itself like a wet dog as 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns opened up simultaneously. In the same instant, somewhere behind him in the chaos of the dive, Cement Flight lost sight of their leader. The speed had been too great, the sky too crowded, the moment too compressed for the wingmen to stay in contact. Anderson didn't know it yet. He was watching the lead Messerschmitt come apart in front of him. He was alone, and the 22 longest minutes of his life had just begun. The first kill happened so fast it barely felt real. Anderson's burst had caught the lead Bf-109 exactly where the engineering diagrams were most unforgiving, the junction of the wing root and the fuselage, where the main spar carried the entire structural load of the aircraft. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds didn't just damage the Messerschmitt, they invalidated it. The right wing folded upward at an angle nature never intended. The Daimler-Benz engine, its coolant lines severed, began venting a white plume of glycol that turned black within seconds. The aircraft departed controlled flight and fell away in a flat, spinning tumble that no pilot was going to recover from. Anderson was already gone, hauling back on the stick with both hands, trading every mile per hour of his dive speed back in altitude. The G-forces arrived like a physical assault, not a sensation so much as a verdict, pressing him down into his seat with 3, 4, 5 times the weight of gravity. The anti-G suit around his legs and abdomen inflated automatically, squeezing like a vice to keep his blood from pooling in his lower body. Even so, the edges of his vision turned gray and soft, the way the edges of a photograph fade when it's been left too long in the light. He climbed back through 24,000 feet, then 25,000, leveled off, and immediately began scanning. "Cement flight, call your position," he said into the radio. The frequency returned nothing useful, fragments of other voices, the bark of radio calls from pilots across the entire engagement area, but nothing from his own flight. The dive had scattered them. In the three-dimensional chaos of a 60-aircraft engagement, 4 Mustangs could lose each other in seconds. His wingmen were out there somewhere, fighting their own battles in their own private corners of the sky. Anderson processed this fact in approximately 1 second and moved on. There was no value in dwelling on it. Below him, the bomber stream was hemorrhaging. The Focke-Wulf 190s were the primary instrument of that hemorrhage, heavy, powerfully armed aircraft specifically optimized for the destruction of large multi-engine targets. A single FW-190 carried armament that could structurally compromise a B-17 in a 2-second burst. They were flying coordinated passes now, pairs of them, one aircraft drawing the defensive fire of the bomber's gunners, while the other slipped into the blind spot beneath the tail and fired upward into the bomb bay. The rational response to Anderson's situation, alone, ammunition partially expended, outnumbered by a ratio that defied reasonable calculation, was to use his remaining speed and altitude to exit the engagement, point the nose west, run for the channel, land at Leiston with the aircraft intact, and file a combat report. Every flight manual ever written would have supported that decision. Anderson rolled Old Crow inverted and pulled the nose back down toward the fight. What he was about to execute was not recklessness. It was a precise tactical application of the one principle that governed aerial combat above all others, the principle that his friend Chuck Yeager once summarized as, "Altitude is money in the bank." By maintaining his position above the engagement and using diving attacks, Anderson could convert altitude into speed on demand, strike before any German pilot could establish a firing solution, and zoom back up to safety before the counterattack organized. It was called boom and zoom, and in the hands of a pilot who understood energy management the way Anderson did, it was essentially a one-sided transaction. He selected a Messerschmitt Bf-109 that was chasing a damaged B-17 with the focused intensity of a predator that has already decided the outcome. The German pilot was good. His peripheral vision or his radio controller warned him in time. He broke hard left the moment Anderson committed to the attack, a maximum rate turn designed to force his pursuer past him and reverse the geometry of the fight. In a slower, turning engagement, the Bf-109's light airframe and powerful engine gave it a turning radius that could embarrass most Allied fighters. Anderson did not try to outturn him. He pressed the stick with measured, deliberate force and pulled a lead pursuit curve, aiming not where the Messerschmitt was, but where the physics of its turn dictated it would be in 1.2 seconds. The distinction is everything. Chasing an aircraft means you are always behind it. Anticipating an aircraft means you are already where it is going.
The physical environment inside the cockpit during this exchange was something that no flight simulator has ever fully replicated. The temperature was still far below freezing, but Anderson was generating enough body heat that his oxygen mask was fogging with each exhalation, requiring him to manually clear his vision. The cordite smell from his own guns had saturated the cockpit atmosphere. His neck, rotating constantly to track the German fighter while simultaneously scanning above, below, and behind for additional threats, was burning with the kind of deep muscle fatigue that precedes the shaking that comes later in the debrief room when the adrenaline finally quits. He closed the range to 250 yards. The Bf-109 reversed its turn, a brief, necessary moment where its bank angle passed through zero and its wings went momentarily flat, like a pendulum at the top of its arc. In that fraction of a second, the aircraft stopped maneuvering and became a predictable object. Anderson fired a burst of perhaps 40 rounds. The Messerschmitt's engine cowling disintegrated. Small pieces of metal, valve covers, cooling fins, fragments of the supercharger housing flew backward and rattled off Anderson's armored windscreen like hailstones. The German engine, robbed of its cooling system, seized within seconds. White smoke became gray smoke, became black. The canopy came off. The pilot went with it, his parachute blooming white against the dark patchwork of the French countryside below. 2 kills in under 8 minutes. Anderson pulled up, and this time when he checked his mirrors, what he saw ended the satisfaction of the moment instantly. 2 Bf-109s, high, fast, perfectly positioned, diving from above and behind with the unhurried confidence of pilots who have calculated the geometry and confirmed the answer. They had altitude, they had speed. Old Crow had neither. Anderson had spent both currencies in the turning fight, and the Germans had arrived at exactly the moment his account was empty. The crosshairs of 2 experienced Luftwaffe pilots were drifting toward the spine of his aircraft. In approximately 4 seconds, they would fire. The hunter, in the precise and clinical language of aerial combat, had become the hunted. 4 seconds is not enough time to think. There is only enough time to act. Anderson's hands moved before his conscious mind had finished framing the problem. His right hand slammed the stick hard over to the right, while his left boot kicked the rudder pedal to the floor. Old Crow snapped into a violent inverted roll, not a gentle bank, but a sudden wrenching reversal that the airframe groaned against, the metal skin flexing under the asymmetric load. For one disorienting moment, Anderson was hanging upside down in his harness, the French countryside filling his canopy above him like a ceiling, the open sky below him like a floor. He pulled the stick straight back into his lap. The split S, the maneuver of last resort for a pilot with no energy and enemies above, sent the Mustang's nose slicing downward through the vertical, converting the aircraft's desperate situation into a controlled plummet. The airspeed indicator wound through 380, 410, 450 miles per hour with the urgency of a clock running backward. The altimeter unwound just as fast, 24,000 feet, 20,000, 17,000. The Packard Merlin, now pointed at the earth and running at full power, contributed its own furious energy to the descent. The 2 Bf-109s followed him into the dive. They shouldn't have. The Bf-109 was an exceptional aircraft, perhaps the most refined expression of the single-engine fighter concept that European engineering produced during the war. But it carried within its design a fundamental limitation that its pilots lived with and its opponents learned to exploit. At speeds above 400 miles per hour, the aerodynamic forces acting on its control surfaces grew beyond what a human pilot's unassisted strength could manage. The ailerons stiffened, the elevator hardened. The aircraft, designed for agility at moderate speeds, became a passenger in its own descent, capable of maintaining direction but robbed of the fine control that made it dangerous.
At 450 miles per hour, the two German pilots found their fighters telling them what to do rather than responding to what they asked. They pulled out of the dive, not from tactical reasoning, but from the straightforward survival instinct of men who felt their aircraft going rigid around them and understood what happened next if they didn't intervene. They climbed away. Anderson watched them go in his rearview mirror, two yellow-nosed shapes shrinking back up into the high blue. He pulled out at 12,000 feet, the G-forces of the recovery compressing his spine and graying the edges of his vision for the third time in 10 minutes. He leveled off, checked his instruments, fuel dropping, ammunition counters lower than he wanted, engine temperature climbing toward the caution arc, and began climbing back toward the bomber stream.
This was the decision point. Any reasonable accounting of the situation supported going home. He was isolated, his ammunition was finite, his fuel margin was shrinking, and the engagement had already cost him more physical reserves than most men carry into a fight. The bombers had their own gunners, they had other escorts. He had done his part. Anderson pointed Old Crow's nose back up toward 28,000 feet. He was 10 minutes into the engagement. He had 12 minutes left, and somewhere above him, the B-17s were still dying. What Anderson did for the next 12 minutes has been analyzed in tactical studies and discussed in aviation circles for 80 years because it represents something genuinely unusual in the history of aerial combat. He did not fly as a single aircraft against the German formation. He flew as a concept, appearing from different angles, at different speeds, from different altitudes, never repeating an attack geometry, never allowing the Luftwaffe pilots to establish a pattern they could predict and counter. He dove on a pair of Focke-Wulf 190s, lining up on the lead bomber box, firing a deflection burst that sent both pilots braking hard in opposite directions, not because his rounds hit either aircraft, but because the rounds were close enough and unexpected enough that the survival instinct overrode the attack instinct. The B-17 they had been targeting flew on unmolested. He came from the east, out of the glare of the morning sun that had shifted position as the formation turned, and hit a Bf-109 that was pursuing a smoking bomber, putting a short burst into its wing before zooming away before the pilot's wingman could react.
He attacked head-on at a pair of 190s, a maneuver so aggressive and counterintuitive that both German pilots broke away rather than hold their course, their nerve failing in the face of an aircraft that appeared to be trying to collide with them. The effect on the German formation was disproportionate to its cause. Pilots communicating on the Luftwaffe tactical frequency began reporting multiple Mustangs, a whole squadron operating with coordinated precision across the entire engagement zone. The ground controller, tracking the radio reports, tried to build a picture of the American force and couldn't. The attacks were coming from too many directions, at too many altitudes, following no discernible pattern. There was no squadron. There was one 22-year-old from Newcastle, California, running on fumes and muscle memory, and something that had no technical name. Anderson's ammunition was nearly gone. He knew it from the counters on his instrument panel, and he knew it from the feel of the guns. The vibration that had shaken the airframe with each burst was becoming intermittent, the bursts shorter, the sound thinner. His fuel state was critical. His arms, having hauled a 9,000-pound aircraft through 22 minutes of maximum performance maneuvering at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe without assistance, had passed through pain and arrived somewhere beyond it. And then the Germans left.
Not all at once. A gradual dissolution, pairs and singles peeling away from the engagement and pointing their noses east toward their airfields in France and Western Germany. Their own fuel states had reached the point where the decision was made for them by arithmetic rather than by will. The massive Gefechtsverband that had rolled across the sky like a river of iron simply drained away.
The bomber stream flew on, battered, depleted, carrying dead and wounded inside aluminum fuselages punctured by cannon shells, but flying, still flying. Anderson checked his clock. 22 minutes had elapsed since he had ordered the tanks dropped. He found a B-17 flying slightly outside its formation and pulled up alongside it, close enough that the waist gunner could see him through the open gun window. Anderson raised a hand. The gunner raised one back. The universal signal, "We're here, you're covered, keep going." Then Anderson turned west, toward England, toward the Channel, toward home. RAF Leiston on the Suffolk coast of England was a functional, unglamorous place. Concrete hard stands, Nissen hut barracks, a control tower that looked like it had been designed by someone who had heard a description of a control tower but never seen one. It smelled of aviation fuel and wet grass and the particular mechanical scent of machines that are worked hard and maintained harder. Old Crow touched down in the late afternoon, its Merlin engine ticking with heat, its silver skin carrying the faint smell of cordite that would linger for days no matter how many times the ground crew wiped it down. Anderson's crew chief, a meticulous sergeant from Ohio named Ray, who regarded Old Crow with a proprietary affection that bordered on paternalism, was on the wing before the engine stopped turning. He looked at the gun panels. He looked at the fuel totalizer. He looked at Anderson's face. Then he climbed down and counted the ammunition. He came back with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something closer to disbelief. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, each fed from a can holding hundreds of rounds at mission start, had a combined total remaining that would have lasted, at the engagement's average rate of fire, approximately 8 more seconds. 8 seconds. The debrief took 2 hours. The intelligence officers wanted every detail: altitudes, headings, engagement durations, the specific behavior of each German aircraft encountered. Anderson gave them what they asked for in the same measured, unhurried voice he used for everything. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatize. When they asked him how he had managed to disrupt attacks across such a wide area of the engagement zone without being shot down, he thought about it for a moment. "I kept moving," he said, "and I tried not to be where they were looking." The official assessment credited him with 2 confirmed aerial victories from the engagement, bringing his running total to a number that would continue climbing until the end of the war. He was, by any measurable standard, having a remarkable career. But the 2 kills on the mission report told less than half the story. The bomber crews who landed that evening, tallying their dead and patching their aircraft, knew something the kill board didn't record. They knew that something had been working the space above them for 22 minutes, something that kept appearing and disrupting and refusing to go away, something that had no right to still be in the fight by the time the Germans gave up and went home. Bud Anderson finished the war with 16.25 confirmed aerial victories. The quarter was a shared kill. 2 pilots in firing position on the same aircraft simultaneously, the credit divided with mathematical fairness. He never lost a wingman across his entire combat career. He was never shot down, never forced to bail out, never returned to base with damage that grounded the aircraft for more than a day. In a war that killed experienced fighter pilots with a casualness that still takes the breath away to read about, this record is not luck. Luck runs out. What Anderson had was a quality of attention and calculation that the combat environment could not degrade no matter how long or how hard it pressed. Chuck Yeager, who was himself no modest judge of flying ability, wrote about Anderson in his autobiography with the directness that characterized everything he said. He called him a mongoose. He called him the best fighter pilot he had ever seen. These were not words Yeager used without meaning them. Anderson went home after the war to California. He married, he raised a family, he flew for the Air Force for years afterward, through the jet age and beyond, accumulating the kind of quiet, sustained record of excellence that doesn't generate many headlines, but never stops being remarkable. He wrote a memoir called To Fly and Fight that reads the way he flew, clean, precise, without unnecessary movement. He lived to see his aircraft, Old Crow, the P-51B with the painted name and the oil smell and the 6 machine guns, restored and displayed, a museum piece visited by people who run their hands along the aluminum skin and try to imagine what 28,000 feet felt like from inside it. He was present for that restoration. He climbed up on the wing and looked into the cockpit the way a man looks at something he had once been very young inside of. He died on May 17, 2024, at Auburn, California, United States. He was 102 years old. Among the things he said in his later years, when people asked him about May 27, 1944, and the 22 minutes above France, he tended to deflect the heroic framing. He would talk about the bomber crews instead. He would talk about the 10 men in each B-17 who had no ability to maneuver, no way to run, who simply had to maintain formation and trust that the fighters above them were doing their jobs. They were the brave ones, he said more than once. We could at least do something.
Bud Anderson could do something. On May 27, 1944, alone above northeastern France, against a river of iron that should have swallowed him whole, he did everything. If this story found you, if you didn't know that a single P-51 pilot from a California farm town held off 60 German fighters and walked away with 8 seconds of ammunition left, please hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel put these stories in front of the people who deserve to hear them. Subscribe if you haven't already. We don't do surface-level history here. We go into the cockpit, into the cold, into the 22 minutes that the textbooks skip over. And leave a comment below. Did someone in your family serve in the air war over Europe? A bomber crewman? A fighter pilot? A ground crew chief who kept these machines flying with his hands? Tell us their name. We read every comment, and these names deserve to be spoken out loud. Bud Anderson kept moving and refused to be where they were looking. Don't quit on this channel. We'll see you in the next one.